I've been using a Georgie for the past 10 or so months, and is a great little keyboard that works really well for stenography. However, I've made a mount for it on my tripod, and while it's not permanently fixed to it, I'd rather not remove it whenever I need to bring a Steno keyboard with me. I always bring a Windows tablet to school, and so I thought it'd be really nice to get a Steno keyboard for it. The only other sub $200 split machine that was available at the time was the Splitography, and so I went with that. I didn't want to get another Georgie for several reasons. First, I already have one, and I wanted to try something new. Secondly, while the Georgie is fairly robust, I just feel like I need something that's more solid and won't flex. Something that I can just put in the back of my bag and not worry about. Finally, I'd also like to be able to use it as a regular keyboard with access to keys which I don't have dictionary entries for. I really dislike the Georgie's corded query mode, and I have so much trouble using it. I should note, however, that if you actually spend some time learning the Georgie's QWERTY layout, you'll probably have a different opinion than mine. So after ordering this Splitography on the 15th of December, it arrived about a month later on January 20. First of all, I'm very happy with how this is made, and it feels really solid. There's no flex whatsoever, and the quality is great. It's rather thick, though it's not as bad as I had anticipated. It measures just shy of 4 centimeters in height. I was thinking of taking off the acrylic plate and making a custom case to reduce the height a little, but I didn't realize that the connector on the bottom actually has some thickness, so that's not really something I can do. Though the removable base plate does allow you to make custom mounts fairly easily just by swapping it out or modifying the plate itself. One thing I've noticed about the connector is that the cable can be in a certain position where the ending D and S keys won't register. I think this is mainly because I was bending the cable quite a lot when I first started using it, as I tried to bring the two halves closer together. So I would not recommend doing something similar. Keep the two halves at a distance so that there is no strain on the cable. I also wanted to make my own cable since I have a big spool of Cat5 Ethernet cable as well as a lot of RJ45 jacks. But the Splitography does not use RJ45. It uses 10P10C connectors, otherwise known as RJ50. These have 10 wires instead of the 8 as found in regular Ethernet cables. I did end up making my own cables that are more reliable when I keep the two halves at a closer distance. You can buy RJ50 jacks, and you can use regular Ethernet cable wire. I used Cat5 cable, but with an extra pair shoved through the insulation. I also made a longer cable without the insulation so that it's much easier to bend. Of course, you'll need a crimping tool like this one, and it should preferably be made for 10 pins. If you used one that's only meant for 8 wires, like I did, the 2 pins on the end of the jack will stick out and you'll need to push these in manually with a pair of pliers. So how does it actually feel to use for Steno? Well, the 40-gram switches are a lot heavier than the 12-gram switches I'm used to on the Georgie. It took me a while to get used to them, but they're actually not too bad. It does mean, however, that I'm not able to Steno for very long. I can only get about 2 minutes of straight use before getting tired. Though overall, it works fine for Steno, and very rarely will you have to be writing for very long without break. It wouldn't be good for real time, but it's good enough for the hobbyist. On my Georgie, I can get about 180 words per minute on average at Monkeytype's 1-minute drill. On the Splitography, I have reached the speed after getting used to the layout, but it's definitely a lot more tiring. Realistically, my average on the Splitography is more like 165 on the same 1-minute test. The lighter springs on the Georgie make all the difference in speed and comfort. I used the Splitography on top of my lab either with a textbook or a board of plywood. I routed some indentations for the two halves to seat in, and that works fairly well. It's not nearly as ergonomic as there's no tenting and tilts, but it works adequately. The keys are custom injection molded and they feel quite nice to the touch. The shape of the keys make chording quite easy, but I must say that the sharp edges of the keys can be a little bit annoying, especially when making complicated chords. Though I found that on the Georgie I'm more prone to accidentally pressing keys, so I'm not sure whether the stock keycaps on the Georgie are any better or worse than the Splitography. It's pretty subjective, I think, and they make a minimal difference. As for the layout, one thing I don't particularly like about the Georgie is the placement of the thumb keys. I prefer non-slanted vowel keys like on the Splitography. With slanted vowel keys, my thumbs bend quite awkwardly as I reach across to chord them. You can see that the Splitography is more natural for me to use. Again, this is all very subjective. Some may like the slanted vowel keys, some may not. The Splitography's number row is quite nice to have, but I don't really see it as a huge benefit. On both my Georgie and the Splitography, I use the top S key as a number key through Plover's configuration, which makes it easier to chord certain combinations, especially with the Georgie. I've seen a lot of people getting into stenography talk a lot about the lack of a number row on the Georgie. This is not extremely important and should not be a major consideration. The thumb keys work just fine for numbers, and you can always map one of the S keys to a number key like I have. But again, the number row is a nice bonus on the splitography. Of course, it also allows for a slightly more conventional non-corded QWERTY mode, so there's that. One complaint about the splitography is that the springs feel very stiff due to the flat force curve. Advice on the supported hardware page mentions that you can remove the secondary leaf spring to mitigate this. I have tried doing so, and I like the feel of the removed leaf spring more. This does, however, make the key presses a bit louder. The springs also rattle around quite a bit with the removed leaf spring. It's not too terribly irritating, but I decided to keep the leaf springs in my splitography to keep it a bit quiet. The stiffness isn't a huge issue for me. And as for how loud the splitography is compared to the Georgie, it's definitely more quiet. And if light springs are a must for you, I should mention that the springs for this splitography can be swapped out fairly easily. The Alp springs are compatible with Chalks, and you can get 12-gram springs fairly easily. To open up one of these Matias quiet switches, you have to open the two tabs on either side and pull the housing straight up. Be careful with the leaf spring and make sure to put it back properly the way you found it, as you can break your switch if you assemble it incorrectly. When you open up the switch, look at how it was put together and make a note of that later. You can always look at the other switches for reference. I've actually gotten 15-gram springs and it feels so much better than the stock ones. In fact, it feels just as good as the Georgie with its 12-gram springs. It's such a joy to use, and my speed with the splitography is on par with my Georgie, if not better. With these light springs, I find the keycaps help me a lot with the cording, and the sharp edges of them don't become much of a problem. But although I seem to be able to steno faster, it's not by a lot, and overall I can steno longer on my Georgie. Of course, that may be because my Georgie has tenting while my splitography does not. With that said, I can definitely steno for a while on my splitography before feeling fatigue. I would absolutely recommend spring swapping, as it really only takes an hour to do both halves. Overall, I think the splitography may be more suited for me, as I tend to make less errors and the cording is quite a bit easier for me. I think because of the reduction in errors, my speed might be a little bit faster than on the Georgie. With the Georgie, I find that I often brush against the side of the keys and mistrigger them quite often. Even though I've used it for almost a year, I'm still facing these problems. With the splitography, the key presses feel a lot more deliberate for me. With that said, I never really paid much attention to accuracy when I was learning steno, and that may be the reason why. Another modification I made was that I changed the protocol to Gemini PR. This allows usage of many more keys since the default protocol, TX-Bolt, is quite limited. If you're interested in different theories that use different layouts, like for other languages, you should definitely switch to Gemini PR, as it allows you to use these extra keys. I kept the other layers the same, and I've included a link to my key map in the description. The splitography also has a Plover N-key rollover mode, which means that you can use it on Android with daughter roll. I would demonstrate, but unfortunately I do not have a dongle that works. So for this, I'll have to show you it in Plover. You can see that if I press the cord to switch into N-key rollover mode, and then change the protocol in Plover appropriately, it works just as fine. This is useful as a fallback if a serial mode is not possible, either through drivers or other software limitations. So what are my overall thoughts on the splitography? Well, it's a great steno keyword and you can't go wrong with it. It's perfectly adequate and it will take you a long way, especially if you swap out the springs for lighter ones. It is also quite robust as long as you're gentle with the cable. I like the removable acrylic base, and the feel of the keycaps and the light springs make it a joy to use. Though even with the stock 40-gram springs, it's still very usable. Just note that with the stock springs, it will be a bit tiring, especially when you pick up some speed. If you're reaching speeds of 120 words per minute and faster, you should definitely swap the springs to prevent repetitive strain injury. I find the QWERTY layer adequate, and I use it from time to access keys I don't have to find in Plover. I might even like the splitography more than my Georgie now that I've swapped the springs. But I really can't say that one is better than the other if you're willing to swap the springs. Of course, the splitography will cost you at least $38 more, and the springs will cost you another $15 plus an hour to swap them. So if you're on a tight budget and you don't have the patience to swap springs, then the Georgie is probably the better option. If price isn't a huge problem for you and you want a few extra features, like a slightly more conventional QWERTY layer, a number row, and the custom injection molded keycaps, then you may want to consider the splitography. It has blown away all my expectations with these swapped springs, and I would recommend it to anyone who is interested in learning stenography. The only gripe I really have with the splitography are the sharp edges of the keycaps. You could fix this with some sandpaper, I suppose, but it won't be something I'll be trying. The edges are only a problem if you're going to be using it for a very long time non-stop. And also, I should note that the Georgie is not without its flaws. Mine in particular had to be sent back because 2 of the keys kept mistriggering despite taking the switches apart and cleaning it out. And sometimes I find that if there's a little flex in the PCB due to an uneven surface, there will be more key bounce and I will mistrigger the keys more often. It's certainly not unusable, but it is a little annoying from time to time. So that's about all I can really say about the splittography. As with all my other videos, feel free to leave any questions below and I'll try to answer them as best I can. I hope this video has been helpful, and I wish you luck wherever you go with stenography.